We shall commence this module by discussing about the gold standard. While the gold standard lacked a formal treaty or arrangement, major industrial countries elected to follow a set of monetary practices that allowed the gold standard to function effectively until the beginning of World War I in 1914. After two world wars and worldwide Great Depression, the transition to pegged rate in 1944 was planned specifically to promote international monetary stability, trade and growth. The Bretton Woods system gave a central role to gold, but it soon became apparent that the United States and the US dollar were the real anchoring points of the system. In contrast, the movement to a floating rate system was not the free choice of policymakers. The tendency for the countries to place domestic economies' priorities ahead of the external economic commitments and the increase in the international capital mobility meant that the exchange rates needed to become more flexible to equilibrate the international capital movements. But after a decade of floating, policymakers sought relief from the increased exchange rate volatility either by intervention to keep exchange rates within the target zones or by the formulation of the regional currency blocks such as European Monetary System (EMS). After studying this module, you shall be able to know the important features of the European monetary system, know about the changes in the system, identify what circumstances led to the different system, evaluate the European monetary system, analyze the aspects of the European monetary system. Let us begin our discussion on the international monetary arrangement in the theory and practice Ronald McKinnon chronology. Necessary for the trading nations to develop system whereby national monies can be used to conduct international transactions such as import and export of goods and services. In this section, we review the principal international monetary systems that nations have adopted over the past century. Each system carries with it a set of rules, sometimes explicit in the form of laws or regulations and sometimes implicit in the form of the conventions or customs. A well-functioning international financial system may be beneficial for securing the gains from the international trade, but it also may be conduit for the transfer of the macroeconomic shocks from one nation to the another. The international financial system is like a factor of the production that can promote the gains from the trade and economic integration of the regions. But it can also impose costs if some nations use the international financial system to export their problems to the other countries. An international financial system rules has evolved to balance these trade-offs. Still, economic policymakers often use discretion when fundamental changes or a crisis situation is at hand. International Financial System (IFS) based on the rules balances these trade-offs. Roland McKinnon 1993 describes the operation of the principal international financial system of the last century. He organizes 7 separate episodes, each with their own set of rules. First, the International Gold Standard 1879 to 1930. Second, the spirit of the Bretton Woods Agreement 1945. Third, the fixed rate dollar standard 1950 to 1970. Fourth, the floating rate dollar standard from 1973 to 1984. Fifth, the Plaza Levore Intervention Accords and the floating rate dollar standard 1985 to 1999. The spirit of the European Monetary System 1979. Seventh, the European Monetary System as a Greater DM 1979 to 1998. Next, we will discuss about the International Gold Standard. The International Gold Standard 1879 till 1913. Gold was available easily, hence the introduction of such a system was obvious to taking out trade practices more easily. There exist rules of games. These are as follows. Fix an official gold price or mint parity and allow free convertibility between the domestic money and the gold at that price. Impose no restrictions on the import or export of the gold by the private citizens or on the use of the gold for the international transactions. Issue national currency and coins only with the gold backing and link the growth in the national bank deposits to the availability of the national gold reserves. In the event of short-term liquidity crisis associated with the gold outflow, the central bank should lend freely to the domestic banks at the higher rate, Begg-Hotz rule. If the Rule 1 is ever temporarily suspended, restore convertibility at the original mint parity as soon as practical. As a result of these practices, the worldwide price level will endogenously determined based upon the overall world demand and supply of gold. Causes of breakdown of the gold standard system. Mint parity. USA adopted gold standard in 1879 and pegged US dollar to gold. Similarly, other countries also pegged their currency to gold. In this way, exchange rate between different currencies is determined. It was believed that the exchange rate was kept in control by the international arbitrage. However, this caused depletion of the gold reserves as gold was easier to move internationally. Price specie flow mechanism gave a relationship between the exchange rate, gold reserve and capital flow in other countries. It explained the gold standard system entirely. Next, we shall discuss the spirit of Bretton Woods Agreement. The spirit of Bretton Woods Agreement 1945. In practice, the system evolved into the fixed rate dollar standard, except for the United States. 1950 to 1970, the major industrial countries had only a handful of the modest exchange rate changes. The rules of the games are as follows. Fix an official par value for the domestic currency in terms of gold or the currency tied to gold as a numerate. In a short run, keep the exchange rate pegged within 1% of its par value, but in long run, leave open the option to adjust the par value unilaterally if the IMF concurs. Permit free convertibility of the currency for the current account transaction, but use capital controls to limit the currency speculation. Offset short-term balance of payment imbalances by the use of official reserve and IMF credits, and sterilize the impact of exchange market intervention on the domestic money supply. Permit national macroeconomic autonomy each member pursues in its own price level and employment objectives. Causes for the breakdown of Bretton Woods Agreement. Inherent flaws in the agreement. With liquidity being introduced into the system, America was drowned in the debt. America being drowned in a debt had two consequences. America would refuse gold for the dollars. Price of the gold would reduce with the devaluation of the dollar, making it difficult to deal with the par values. Acceptance of ever increasing amounts of the demand liabilities of the United States in the monetary reserves, as the dollar and the gold was related with the determination of the exchange currency. Impact of the hot money flows. The Bretton Woods system did not have any mechanism to prevent the problems the balance of payment on the capital account because of hot money flows. Stability of the Bretton Woods system could not only be realized if the United States consistently ran balance of payment deficit, enabling steady stream of dollars and thus fueling global growth. The SDR was created in 1969 to supplement the dollar as a reserve asset, to serve as a unit of account for international transaction, and to provide for the substitution of the gold within the operation of IMF. SDR can be used to make payments to the journal account of IMF, as well as for the other financial transactions such as loan, swaps of the currencies, securities for the loans and the forward operations, selling SDR for the delivery at the future date, and to make payments or grants. Moving on to discuss the fixed rate dollar standard. The fixed rate dollar standard from 1950 to 1970. Rules of the games are as follows. Industrial countries other than the United States fix an official pay value for the domestic currency in terms of US dollar and keep exchange rate within 1% of this par value indefinitely. Permit free convertibility of the currency for the current account transaction. Use capital control to insulate domestic financial markets but begin liberalization. Use the US dollar as the intervention currency and keep official reserves in the US Treasury bonds. Elevate the importance of maintaining the fixed exchange rate. Make domestic monetary policy subordinate to this target as well as to the price level of the traded goods in United States. Limit current account imbalances by adjusting national fiscal policy, government expenditures minus tax revenue to offset imbalances between the private practice free trade without a balance of payment or exchange rate target. United States remain passive in the foreign exchange market practice free trade without a balance of payment or exchange rate target. Keep US capital markets open for borrowing and investing by private residents and foreign sovereigns. Maintain an international creditor position in the dollar denominated asset and limit fiscal deficit. Pursue an independent monetary policy that establishes stable price for the tradable goods. Redundancy problem arises in a world with n countries because the policy of n-1 of those countries are sufficient to determine the policy of the nth country. The nth country must remain passive. It cannot act independently. Once n-1 signatory countries had set par values in terms of US dollar, the United States had little choice but to remain passive in the foreign exchange market. This was the liberating side. The United States alone could exercise monetary independence to provide a stable price level for tradable goods. But then there was a constraining side. The United States had to provide a stable world price level and a monetary policy that met the needs of other n-1 countries. Otherwise, tensions were bound to develop if the internal macroeconomic objectives of all n countries were not met. This was clearly a tall order to sustain over 20-year period. The system worked well in 1950s. Europe and Japan found it convenient to rely on United States to supply a stable price environment and for access to the dominant US capital markets. Threatened to exercise a speculatory run on the US gold stock. By the 1960s, the accumulation of US liabilities abroad continued, leading to the famous Triffin dilemma. Robert Triffin, based upon the US commitment to convert the currency into the gold, a $35 per ounce, the stock of the US liabilities held by the foreigners would exceed the US gold reserves within a few years. Even though US monetary policy remained creditable, through the mid-1960s, the Triffin dilemma threatened to excite a speculative run on the US gold stock. Concern over continued gold losses led to new restrictions on the US capital outflows and formal step to make conversion of the dollars into gold more costly. Other stopgap measures were taken in the late 1960s. A two-tier market for the gold was introduced to let the private market price of the gold adjust upward while maintaining the $35 per ounce official price, and special drawing right was introduced as a paper gold substitute to increase the supply of non-dollar international reserves. Next, we shall understand the floating dollar standard. The floating rate dollar standard 1973 to 1984, US dollar fulfilled the primary functions of the money medium of exchange, store of value and unit of account better than any alternative. In private transactions, nearly all exchange rates continued to be quoted in terms of US dollars. Primary commodities continued to be priced in terms of the US dollars. 75% of the claims in offshore markets were denominated in US dollar. To assess the external value of the domestic currencies, officials would typically refer to an exchange rate in US dollar. And when intervention was called for it, it was generally conducted in US dollar. The system was floating, but it was far from freely floating, laissez-faire system. IMF recognized that each country saw its exchange rate as an important policy variable and that the exchange rate policy of one country could have a significant negative spill over effects on the other countries. In 1947, IMF enacted a set of guidelines to limit potential conflicts. The IMF allows a broad range of intervention techniques from the simple smoothing operations intended to limit short-run volatility in the exchange rate up to the exchange rate targeting operation designed to peg the value of the currency at the specific level range. Indeed, many countries continued to peg their currency to the US dollar or the currency of a major trading partner after 1973. Essentially, the foreign exchange rate was left to play the role of the residual variable that did a great deal of adjusting to offset the macroeconomic policies differences across the countries. With the little coordination of these policies, one would exchange rate volatility to increase sharply. Now, let us discuss the Plaza-Louvre intervention accords and the floating rate dollar standard. In 1981, the introduction of an expansive US fiscal policy combined with the tight monetary control started the US dollar to a prolonged appreciation. By early 1985, the US dollar had appreciated nearly 50% in real terms against an average of the world's other major currencies. As the US dollar rose higher, some economists characterized its price behavior as a speculative bubble. And as predicted, that the foreign exchange value of the dollar was not sustainable. The rules of the games are as follows. Germany, Japan and United States G3 set board targets zone for the $/DM and $/yen exchange rates. Do not announce the agreed upon central rates and allow for the flexible zonal boundaries. Allow the implicit central rates to adjust when economic fundamentals amongst the G3 countries change substantially. Central banks intervene collectively but infrequently to reverse the short-run exchange rate trends that threaten a zonal boundary, signal the collective intent by announcing rather than the hiding intervention. G3 countries hold reserves in each other's currencies. For the United States, this means building up the reserves in the Deutsche market, yen and possibility other than the convertible currencies. Sterilize the immediate impact of the exchange market intervention by not adjusting short-term interest rates. Each G3 country aims its monetary policy towards stable prices, reduces drift in exchange rate target zones, support or do not oppose intervention by G3 to keep the dollar within its target zone limits. Trade balance US decreasing. Import competing firms naturally sought protection in the form of trade barriers. European policymakers leaned towards the tighter monetary policy to halt the slide of their currencies, but the downside of the tighter money was an adverse effect on the domestic economic performance. 1985, the new set of policy. Exchange rates were too important to be left to the market forces. So, intervention was deemed appropriate to smooth disorderly market and halt market excesses, and the exchange rate were too important to be the residual form uncoordinated economic policies. So, better policies coordination was required to establish a set of economic fundamentals that in turn would produce a smoother path of the exchange rate. Macroeconomic coordination. As a result, since 1985, a new set of rules has evolved, emphasizing the role of exchange market intervention and macroeconomic policies. On September 22, 1985, officials from the group of the G5 countries, Britain, France, West Germany, Japan and United States met at a Plaza Hotel in the New York City. the G5 officials issued a communique announcing that they would intervene jointly to foster a dollar depreciation. The dollar fell sharply on this news and continued to decline through 1986. Exchange market intervention were often characterized by learning against the wind behavior to reverse a market trend. The Plaza meeting had the central bank leaning with the wind of recently weak dollar. Further, exchange market intervention were often kept secret and were often the doings of a single central bank. The Plaza meeting resulted in the coordinated intervention among the several central banks and an open announcement of the intervention activity. The Plaza meeting provided a clear signal to the market that the major industrial countries were willing to intervene in a coordinated effort to influence the exchange rules. The G5 countries plus Canada made another attempt at exchange rate cooperation in a meeting held at Louvre in Paris on February 22, 1985. The substance of the Louvre meeting was a set of the target zones or exchange rate ranges that the central bankers agreed to defend using the active foreign exchange intervention. The exact target zone were never published, but the observers believed that the Louvre, according to the specified bands of plus minus 5.0% around the central value of 18,250 DM/dollar and 153.50 yen/the dollar, the exchange rates of the Friday before the Louvre meeting. Critics of the Louvre Accord argued that the target zone strategy could have no real force and the decision to keep the zonal boundaries secret was simply a device to prevent any evaluation of the policy's success. Indeed, policy makers have had to adjust the central rate of the implied target zone and the flexible about the precise location of the target zone boundary. Intervention under the Louvre Accord seemed to be more successful when accompanied by the macroeconomic policy changes and less successful when the domestic market policy is preserved through the sterilized intervention. The Louvre Accord began a process toward a greater end. It was hoped better policy coordination. Progress in this coordination process is essential to fundamentally affect the stability of the exchange rate in the longer run. Moving on to understand the spirit of the European monetary system. European national pursued their own efforts to limit exchange rate fluctuation against each other and to establish coordinated macroeconomic policies across Europe. European countries adopted the Werner Plan. Its aim was to limit exchange rate fluctuations. The European Council, the body uniting heads of the states of EU member countries, adopted the Werner Plan. A time series chart of exchange rate movements traced out a snake in a tunnel with intra-European currency changes. Being small, the snake, relative to the larger European currency changes against the US dollar, the tunnel. After the breakdown of the Bretton Woods and the Smithsonian Agreement, European countries met again in April 1972 and set the snake's band at 2.25% and the tunnel's band at 4.50%. In March 1973, the European Council voted to abolish the tunnel and let European currency float against the US dollars while preserving the snake. The 1973-1978 period witnessed many currency realignments as well as entrances to and exits from the snake agreement. The European Monetary System (EMS) was built upon three building blocks: the European Currency Unit (ECU), the Exchange Rate Mechanism (ERM), the European Monetary Corporation (EMCF). Together, these components linked together European exchange rates and monetary policies until the chaotic events of 1992 and 93, discussed later in this chapter, put the future of the EMS in the jeopardy. The European Union overcame these episodes of turmoil and worked toward even close financial cooperation through the formation of the European Economic and Monetary Union (EMU) in 1999. Now, let us discuss the European monetary system as a greater DM. The European monetary system as a greater DM 1979-1998 rules of the games are as follows. All the member countries avoid using the credit facilities of the European Monetary Corporation Fund. Member countries except Germany intervene inside the formal bilateral parity bands to stabilize currency values vis-a-vis the Deutsche market, intervene in the DM rather than in the US dollars. Keep exchange reserves in the DM instruments as well as in the US Treasury bonds reserve in DM. Adjust national monetary growth and short-term interest rate to support exchange market interventions. Subordinate national monetary policy so that the long-term price inflation converges or to remain the same as that in Germany. Continue to liberalize capital controls. Germany remained passive in the foreign exchange market with respect to the other EMS countries. Keep German capital markets open for borrowing and investing by foreign residents and sovereigns. Sterilize the effect of the official intervention on the German monetary policy. Set German monetary policy independently to serve as an anchor for the EMS price level. In 1989, European Council Committee headed by the European Commission President Jacob Delors presented a plan to establish a single European central bank would get a monetary policy for a single European money, thereby abolishing national monies and an independent role for a national central bank. Delors' plan recommended a three-stage process to phase in EMU. Bring all 12 members EC countries into the ERM while bringing tighter convergence of the monetary policy to secure the ERM. Narrow the permissible bands of the ERM and permit a new European Central Bank to exercise more control of the national monetary policies. Replace national monies with a common currency, placing the responsibility for the European monetary policy within the European Central Bank that reflects the interest of all EC countries. We will now summarize what we have learned from this module. Our country retains their national currencies. However, these countries encouraged to take part in the new exchange rate mechanism where their currencies are permitted to fluctuate with the band 15% either sides of the central rate against the euro. European Council selected 11 countries, virtually all EU countries except those who desired to opt out of the starting group which waited to join but clearly had not met the convergent requirements. Without question, the EU countries had made the substantial progress towards meeting the Maastricht conversion requirements. However, the large initial EMI was made possible by the related interpretation of the Maastricht criteria and those of the creative accounting.